Okay, so I just wanted to do a quick video on the HiFiMAN HE600. HiFiMAN released a number of headphones all at once, and the community consensus seems to be that the HE600 is the best one. Unless, of course, you're this guy, who I will affectionately refer to as Professor Warmpoo, who prefers the Edition XV. Now, I also happen to have the Edition XV in, and I do think it's a very good headphone. But I want to talk about the HE600, because it has HE6 in the name. And as some of you might be aware, HE6 gets me all kinds of excited. So let's get going with the video. All right, so the context here is that this is the original HE6, which is a legendary headphone for very good reasons. It's a very, very good sounding headphone. So HiFiMAN coming out with the HE600 is, there's maybe a little bit of a naming service going on here. And actually, some of the marketing material that I've seen around the HE600 and some of the community narratives that have emerged is that it's supposed to sound kind of like an HE6. It doesn't, but that's not actually a bad thing. This is a very good sounding headphone. And in today's video, I'm going to get into all of that good stuff. Just to get the what is this out of the way, this is of course a planar magnetic open back headphone that comes in at around $800, so it is one of the more expensive ones of this new line of HiFiMAN headphones. The other ones being the Ananda Unveiled, which comes in at around $550, and the Edition XV, which is around, how much is this? $400. So the Edition XV is like half the price, but the sound signatures that you get here are sufficiently different where I don't think this is a matter of like one is like better than the other. It's more just what you prefer. So let's talk about the HE600 here, and I want to go through the build quality, the design, and the comfort, and all of that good stuff first. And just for reference, HiFiMAN did send these to me along with the Audivina LE, which is a, yeah, it's interesting. But big shout outs to HiFiMAN for sending these in for review. I know I'm late, but we're doing it. All right, we're doing it. And of course, they haven't paid me to say anything in particular about it, and all thoughts and opinions here are my own. So with the HE600, the build quality here is better than that previous line that they had. So you get a number of improvements to the chassis design, at least in my opinion, over headphones like the Sundara, because you do have a little bit of cup swivel here. There's a little bit more give, and making it more forgiving of differently shaped heads. I have a large head, so this is a common problem for me. The headband piece is much nicer looking than the previous designs that they ended up going with for headphones like the Edition XS. And there's now, thankfully, a suspension strap style design underneath. I do wish that the suspension strap was maybe a little bit bigger, or maybe had a little bit of give to it, because when I put this on my head, I gotta max out the clicks here. When I put it on my head, this feels like it's just a little too tightly pulled. So it's like it doesn't go out far enough. It's not like it clamps too hard for me, but it does clamp a little bit. And that also makes it so there's a little bit of pressure on top of my head. So maybe this is something where folks can develop aftermarket headband straps. I like the headband strap generally, but you know, this particular one I think could be better. But thankfully, this is a very lightweight headphone. This comes in at around 380, 390 grams, much lighter than what you got with the original HE6. And overall, I do find this to be more comfortable than the HiFiMAN Sundara, which was also a very good headphone, but it had some rigid clampiness going on that I couldn't get into. So one last little change here. I'm not sure folks are going to be familiar with this, but with the older sort of circular HiFiMAN designs, you can actually take the grill off because it was just sort of affixed in there with a plastic ring around the outside. With this design, this grill seems to be more fitted into the actual cup design, and it's not something you just take off from the outside. At least I haven't found a way to do that. It looks better, it feels better. It doesn't feel quite as like rickety for the cup, because that would sometimes slide around a bit, but also it is maybe less flexible for modification, if that's what folks were getting into with these designs. To do with the drivability, this is also easier to drive, quite a bit easier to drive than the original HE6. This has an impedance of around 28 ohms, and the sensitivity is around 94 dB per milliwatt. If you are unsure if your equipment can run these headphones or any headphones, we actually have a power calculator up on headphones.com. We recently did a full revamp to that power calculator. I'll leave that linked in the description, but essentially all you need to do here is input the specs that the headphone has for its power requirements into the power calculator here, and this will show you the kind of amplification that you're going to need, and also give you a list of compatible amplifiers There's a very good chance with most modern headphones that you probably won't need anything at all, but in case you have an HE6, that's worth considering. And speaking of headphones.com, they are of course the sponsor of this channel, so if you like what we do here, if you find any of it useful and you want to support us, consider making your next headphone purchase at headphones.com, because not only does that make our content possible here, it also allows us to do all the measurement initiatives that we're trying to do for the community. Okay, let's now talk about the sound quality for the HiFiMAN HE600. And right away, this one to me doesn't sound like an HE6. But as I said earlier on, that might actually be okay. The original HE6 was a very intense and highly detailed sounding headphone, but it also had a couple of quirks to do with its frequency response. This could be improved by putting different pads on it, like the Sundara pads, but the default pads that the HE6 came with were kind of weird. With the Sundara pads on it, it still retained some of that character and still had a kind of lively and angry kind of sound to it in a good way. And I suppose there is some of that is reminiscent here, but the big sort of claims to fame about its sense of intensity and physical impact, particularly down low, that is what I don't get from this one here. And there are reasons for that. And I've just been comparing these back and forth. The HE6 has a very low resonance frequency. What this means is that you would get a kind of low frequency boost behavior going on when there was some sort of air gap between the pads and the side of the head or between the baffle and the pads. And that's because of its design. I don't know if this was intentional. This would be a very common thing to occur. This combined with some of its quirks throughout the mid-range, particularly that forward character around like a 1 kilohertz, and then some of its more intense, focused and incisive treble presentation, gave it that kind of character. And with the HE600, it doesn't have that character. It doesn't have that super intense, blammy kind of sound, but it is better, I think, for its sense of timbre and tonality. And that's because the HE600 sounds a lot more like a Sundara. In fact, its overall acoustic behavior is very similar to a Sundara. Now, folks might be thinking, well, that's a much less expensive headphone. This is ridiculous. Yes, that is true. But there are enough differences here where you might want to consider this to be kind of like a Sundara Plus in a way. But it really does depend on the kind of sound that you're looking for here. So let's go through the measurements here, and I'm going to show you guys here the behavior across multiple different heads. This is to get the broadest picture of how these devices actually perform. So this is measured both on the Gross 43AG with the KB5000 pinna and also the B&K 5128, which has the more accurate acoustic impedance. So we're getting information here for how this performs on two different ears, and you can see it actually behaves pretty similarly across both. For higher acoustic impedance designs, you're going to have more behavior variation. And so it's worth pointing out, this is low acoustic impedance, it's very open, and it is undamped. But as you can see with the frequency response here, the HE600 has basically a linear bass extension all the way down to 20 hertz. It tapers off a little bit, right at around 20 hertz, but this is a little bit more extended than the Sundara here. But again, the behavior is pretty similar. There was a character for the Sundara that would actually lift the bass kind of closer to like 60 hertz, 50 hertz, and then it would kind of roll off below 30 pretty strongly. And that's because with the Sundara, there was a gap between the pad ring and the side of the cup, and this would incur the air gap, and that's where the resonance frequency would boost the bass. Super nerdy stuff. But with this one, it doesn't seem to have quite that same behavior. This is instead a little bit more extended, but not quite as elevated. I don't think folks are going to notice that much of a difference between the two. Then for the mid-range, it's basically linear mid-range. It doesn't have as much of a dip in the upper mids as what you get with the Edition XV or the Edition XS or some of those other egg-shaped HiFiMAN models. Again, more similar here to what you get with the Sundara. This imparts a better sense of textural clarity for certain types of instrument tones, like piano tones and string instruments and that kind of stuff. And then for the ear gain presentation, as this goes into where the ear amplifies frequencies the most strongly, for the rise up to 3 kilohertz, this is bang on where I want it to be. I think if it were a little bit higher here, but for 3 to 5 kilohertz, that would come across a little bit on the edgy side. Again, right on the edge for me for that whole range, but not over the edge. And this imparts a ton of clarity. So if you're listening to well-recorded music, music with instruments, this is going to give you a very good sense of clarity overall, a good sense of detail for you know, the finer little nuances in those instrument tones. Things ring out with a ton of clarity. There's nothing compressed sounding going on, but it does come across a little bit more focused towards the mid-treble than what you got on something like the Sundara. And so this means that for certain types of tones, like cymbal hits and stuff like that, the focus goes more towards the midsection of that crash rather than the sort of upper edges of the upper sort of resonant harmonics of those tones. So to me, that's really the main difference between the HE600 and the Sundara. It's a focusing of the sound slightly down towards those more mid-treble regions because it's less emphasized in the upper treble. And there's a couple of other differences there throughout to do with the various different little, you know, peaks and dips and stuff like that. For the most part, we don't want to be reading the tea leaves too hard on this kind of stuff because it's going to shift depending on the ear that it's placed on, depending on the head. But perceptually, this sounds mostly good with most music to me. The exception here is that for certain types of recordings that are more rock and metal oriented, more intense or aggressive recordings, this can be a little bit overboard for me. This can be a little bit on the aggressive side, the intense side. But it really depends. Like if you are the kind of person who wants your music to sound like that, then this would be fine. But for those genres, I tend to prefer the kind of sound signature, the more relaxed sound signatures like what you get with the Edition XV. For harmonic distortion and any of that kind of stuff that is less perceptually relevant than people think, the HE600 doesn't have any meaningful problems, and it is going to be a little bit better performing for its modal characteristics compared to the Edition XV and the Ananda Unveiled. That's those wibbly wobbly mids that you see there on those headphones. Those are also not really that perceptually relevant. Like, don't think that's stuff that you need to EQ, but it does make it so that this design, this kind of more circular design with the slightly smaller diaphragms, it's going to be a little bit more consistent across the board. So from a unit to unit basis, and also it's going to make it a bit easier to EQ, particularly in the treble, if that's what you wanted to do. I don't worry too much about the wibbly wobbly mids that you see there with some of those highly modal planar drivers, like the really large ones. That's just what you're going to get, and that's going to be slightly different on a unit to unit basis. So that's one area where I prefer this kind of design. Now, I want to compare this a little bit to the Edition XV. As said, this one is twice the price, but this one is also the more clarity focused one. The Edition XV is the more warm, relaxed, you know, chilled out kind of sound. I do find the HE600 to sound more detailed than the Edition XV. I find it to sound more clear, but the Edition XV is more versatile. With the Edition XV, for whatever reason, on my head, I get a bit of a peak there in the upper treble that is not there on the HE600. And for the type of music that I listen to primarily, which is, again, more instrument focused, more acoustic focused, jazz, that kind of stuff, the HE600 is the better headphones, the better sounding headphone. And I was directly comparing this to the Edition XV for those recordings, for that kind of music, and found that the Edition XV could occasionally come across a little bit on the sluggish side, a little bit on the lacking clarity side for those types of tones. But I have to also recognize, like, there were times when the Edition XV would just straight up sound better, and that's because whatever recording I was listening to with this would just be way too intense and aggressive, and not quite as like refined and effortless as even some of HiFiMAN's higher end models. So the other comparison, this is totally unfair, but to compare this to something like the Susvara, that has a ability to have a more, again, bass light tonality similar to this, while still sounding refined and effortless and smooth, at least to my ear, whereas this one is not quite there, right? This is like some steps behind a headphone like that, but I think still really good. Lastly, comparing this to the Ananda Unveiled, which I also have here, the Ananda Unveiled I found to be too lean. So between the two, the HE600 is more my kind of thing. Between the Edition XV and the HE600, it's a tough call. And I've been going back and forth on this. I think originally I preferred the Edition XV, but the more I listen, the more I get more wow moments from the HE600. But that's not to say that I get the same kinds of wow moments that I get with the original HE6. It is not as timbrally appropriate as what you get with this, but it is more a fireworks show that I think when people hear that, they will go, whoa, that's intense and that's crazy. So to me, at least, the HE600 is HE6 in name only, but it also has some advantages over the HE6, namely that it is much lighter, much more comfortable, much easier to drive, and it has an overall timbral balance that is maybe a little bit more appropriate and consistent than the HE6, where the HE6 would be more about some of those colorations and that fireworks show that it would have, particularly to do with the bass and then that mid-range forwardness around 1 kilohertz. So to me, it's like if you are chasing that ultra intense, punchy, incisive kind of thing, the original HE6 is still going to be better than the 600 for that. If you're chasing a more appropriate sense of tone and timbre, the HE600 is probably going to be better than the HE6. Again, to me, this is much more Sundara-like than it is HE6-like, but I think that's a good thing. The Sundara was a great headphone. It's just that it's a lot less expensive now. And that's really the only area where, to me, I'm like, like it's almost like this should be closer in price to the Edition XV, so it'd be a more fair comparison between the two. But that's not to say that this wouldn't be the one that I would choose. I would choose this over the Edition XV and the Ananda Unveiled. So out of the new HiFiMAN releases, the HE600 is the one that I would choose, but just by a little bit, and I do think, I was saying this in one of the live streams that we did, this new series from HiFiMAN is kind of like a return to form. It's a subtle evolution of the sound that they're known for and going in a positive direction. And the mechanical design is much improved over those previous ones as well. So these make them more usable products. So yes, I do recommend the HE600. I think people need to think of this more as like a Sundara Plus or Sundara Adjacent with a couple of advantages over that headphone. And I feel at least that it is worth also considering the Edition XV as well, just that they're in very different price categories. Anyways, that is all for me today. If you would like to see additional measurements done of the HiFiMAN HE600, that will be posted up on the forum at forum.headphones.com. If you'd like to chat with me or other like-minded audio folks, you can do so in our Discord, also linked below. I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye for now.